I booked the Airbnb around 9:40 p.m. after my original hotel reservation got cancelled at the last minute, and by the time I actually reached the place it was a little past midnight. It was in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside a small town I was passing through, one of those areas where the streetlights are spaced too far apart, and everything feels dimmer than it should, even though nothing looks obviously wrong. And I remember thinking how oddly silent it was when I stepped out of my car, like there were no dogs barking, no distant traffic, nothing except the faint hum of insects somewhere in the grass, which only made the silence feel heavier. The house itself was a two-story place with white siding that looked slightly gray under the weak porch light, and the listing had said it was recently renovated. But up close there was something off about it, like the windows seemed darker than they should have been, as if they were absorbing light instead of reflecting it, and I told myself I was just tired from driving. The host had messaged me earlier saying he wouldn't be around but the key would be under the mat, which it was, exactly where he said, and when I unlocked the door it opened without resistance, almost too smoothly, like it had been used recently, even though no one was supposed to be there. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell, not something strong or rotten. Just a faint musty odor mixed with something metallic that I couldn't place, and it lingered in the back of my throat in a way that made me want to keep swallowing. I flicked on the light and the living room looked clean, almost staged, with a couch, a coffee table, and a TV mounted on the wall. But there were no personal items at all, no photos, no books, nothing that made it feel like anyone had ever lived there, which I guess is normal for an Airbnb. But it still felt unusually empty, like a display rather than a home. I locked the door behind me out of habit and set my bag down, and that's when I heard the first noise, a soft thump from somewhere upstairs, like something shifting or settling, and I froze for a second, listening, but it didn't happen again, so I assumed it was just the house, maybe old wood or temperature changes. I checked my phone, no new messages from the host, and I considered texting him just to ask if anyone had been there recently, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I let it go and started walking around the ground floor, turning on lights as I went, noticing how every room had that same staged look, like it had been cleaned too perfectly, with nothing out of place, no signs of actual use. The kitchen was spotless, the sink completely dry, and even the trash can was empty, not even a liner inside. Which struck me as odd because usually there's at least something, even in rentals. I told myself it was probably just well maintained and tried to relax, but there was this constant feeling in the back of my mind that I was missing something obvious, like when you walk into a room and forget why you went there in the first place. After a few minutes, I grabbed my bag and headed upstairs to find the bedroom, and as soon as I stepped onto the first stair, it creaked loudly, sharper than I expected, echoing through the house in a way that made me glance back at the front door, even though I knew I had locked it. The staircase turned slightly at the top, and there was a narrow hallway with 3 doors, one of them slightly open, and I remember noticing how the air felt cooler up there, almost like a draft, even though all the windows I had seen were closed. I pushed the first door open and found a bathroom, clean and empty, same as downstairs, then the second door, which was the bedroom I had booked, with a neatly made bed and folded towels placed at the foot, and for a moment I felt relieved, like everything was normal after all. I set my bag down on the bed and sat for a second, listening again. But the house was completely silent now, almost too silent, like it was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the third door at the end of the hallway, the one that had been slightly open when I came up. And I was sure I hadn't touched it, but now it looked like it was closed, not fully, just enough that the gap was gone, and I stood there for a second trying to remember if it had always been like that, or if I had just imagined it, and before I could convince myself either way, I heard a slow, deliberate creak from the other side of that door, like someone inside had just shifted their weight. I didn't move at first. I just stood there in the bedroom doorway staring down the hallway at that third door, trying to convince myself the sound had to be something normal, like the house settling again. But the way it happened felt too deliberate, too controlled, like it came from something that knew exactly how much noise it was making, and after a few seconds of nothing, the silence came back even heavier than before, pressing in around me. I remember checking my phone again, more out of instinct than anything, like maybe seeing a notification would ground me somehow, but there was nothing new, and the time read 12:17 a.m., which made me realize how late it actually was and how isolated I was in that moment. I told myself I wasn't going to be the kind of person who jumps at every little sound, so I stepped out into the hallway and walked slowly toward that door, my footsteps sounding louder than they should have against the wooden floor, and with each step I kept expecting to hear something again from the other side, but there was nothing, just that same unnatural quiet. When I reached the door, I noticed the handle wasn't fully turned, like it hadn't been shut all the way, and I hesitated for a second before pushing it open, half expecting someone to be standing right there. But the room was empty. It was smaller than the bedroom, almost like a storage room, but there wasn't much inside. Just a single chair placed in the center of the floor facing the wall, which struck me as strange because there was no reason for it to be positioned like that, and there were no boxes or shelves or anything else that would suggest it was being used for storage. I stepped inside anyway, scanning the corners, checking behind the door, even glancing up at the ceiling as if that would somehow reveal something, but there was nothing, and yet the feeling that I wasn't alone didn't go away, it actually got worse. Like being in that room made it more intense. I backed out slowly and pulled the door shut behind me, this time making sure it was fully closed, and I stood there for a moment listening again, but still nothing. At that point I decided I was just overthinking everything. Probably because I was tired and in an unfamiliar place, so I went back into the bedroom and closed that door too, locking it even though I knew that probably wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in, but it made me feel a little better. I set my bag on the floor, took off my shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling, like I was being watched from somewhere I couldn't see. After a few minutes, I lay down fully clothed, telling myself I would just rest for a bit before going to sleep. And I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is waking up suddenly to a sound that took me a second to recognize. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere close, and as I lay there in the dark, still half asleep, I realized it was coming from the bedroom door, 3 light taps, evenly spaced, followed by a pause, then 3 more. I held my breath and listened, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. It kept repeating the same pattern, like someone on the other side was waiting for a response. I didn't say anything at first, I just stayed completely still, but after what felt like a full minute of that tapping, I finally forced myself to speak, my voice sounding quieter than I intended when I asked, "Hello?" And the tapping stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, because now it felt like whatever was out there was listening to me, just as much as I was listening to it. I waited, expecting some kind of reply, maybe the host, maybe someone who had the wrong house, anything that made sense, but there was nothing, just that same heavy quiet. After a few seconds, I slowly sat up, keeping my eyes on the door, and that's when I noticed the handle. It moved slightly, just a small twitch at first, like someone testing it, and then it turned a little more, stopping only when it hit the lock. And I felt my chest tighten as I realized someone was actually trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and slid off the bed as quietly as I could, not taking my eyes off the door, and the handle moved again, more forcefully this time, followed by a soft push that made the door rattle against the frame. I didn't know what to do, whether to call the host, call the police, or just stay quiet and hope they would leave. But before I could decide, I heard something that made everything worse, A low voice from the other side, barely above a whisper, saying my name. Clearly and slowly, like they were making sure I heard it. The moment I heard my name, something in my head just snapped into focus, because there was no logical way anyone should have known it, not from outside the house, not from anywhere nearby, and I remember gripping my phone so tightly my hand started to cramp as I backed away from the door, trying to stay as quiet as possible, even though my breathing had already gotten louder than I could control. I didn't respond. I didn't move toward the door. I just stood there in the corner of the room, staring at the handle as if looking away would somehow make it worse, and for a few seconds nothing happened. Then the voice came again, still low, still calm, repeating my name with the same slow, deliberate tone, like it wasn't asking for my attention, it already had it. I finally forced myself to unlock my phone and pull up the Airbnb app, my hands shaking just enough to make it hard to type. And I opened the reservation details to message the host, but before I could even start writing, I noticed something that didn't make sense. The host's name was different from the one I remembered earlier, completely different, like I had booked with one person and now it was showing another, and for a second I thought maybe I had just misread it before. But the profile picture was different too, and there was no message history anymore, just an empty thread. I felt this cold drop in my stomach as I refreshed the page, thinking it might be some kind of glitch, but it stayed the same, and that's when I heard the sound of the handle turning again, this time more slowly, followed by a faint scraping noise, like something metal was being pressed against the lock from the outside. I didn't wait after that. I opened my dialer and called emergency services, keeping my voice as low as I could as I gave them the address from the listing, explaining that someone was trying to get into the room I was in. And the operator told me to stay on the line and find somewhere safe, which didn't really help because there was nowhere in that room that felt safe. While I was on the phone, the noise at the door stopped again, and for a brief moment I thought maybe they had left, but then I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and steady, moving away from the bedroom and toward the stairs, and that was somehow even worse, because now I had no idea where they were. I stayed on the line, whispering everything I was hearing, and after about a minute, I heard the front door downstairs open, the sound carrying up through the house in a way that made it clear it wasn't just in my head, followed by the same slow footsteps moving across the floor below, and then silence again. The operator kept telling me officers were on the way, but time felt stretched out, like every second was taking longer than it should. And I didn't feel any safer knowing someone had just been inside the house and could still be nearby. I stayed in that room until I finally saw flashing lights through the window, and only then did I unlock the door and step out into the hallway, calling out to the officers as they entered the house. They cleared every room, including that small one with the chair, but they didn't find anyone, no signs of forced entry, no open windows, nothing out of place except for one thing I hadn't noticed before, which was that the lock on my bedroom door had deep scratches around it, like someone had tried to pry it open multiple times, not just that night, but before. When I showed them the Airbnb listing, it took a few seconds for it to even load, and when it did, the page looked incomplete, missing photos, missing details, and then it just disappeared entirely, replaced by an error message saying the listing was no longer available. One of the officers asked me if I was sure I had the right address, and I said yes. I had followed the map directly from the app, and he just nodded in this way that didn't really reassure me. I ended up leaving with them and staying at an actual hotel for the rest of the night, and the next day I tried to contact Airbnb support, but they couldn't find any record of my reservation, not under my name, not under my email, nothing at all. And they told me it was possible I had booked through a third-party site without realizing it, which didn't make sense because I knew exactly what app one had used. The strangest part, though, is what happened a few days later when I checked my bank account, because the charge for that stay was still there, but instead of showing a company name or anything recognizable, it was just a string of numbers, and when I tried to look it up, it didn't lead anywhere. I never went back to that house, and I never found out who was inside it that night. But sometimes I still think about the way that voice said my name, like it had been expecting me, like I wasn't just a random guest who happened to book that place, but someone who had been specifically meant to end up there. And the worst part is, every now and then, usually late at night when everything's quiet, I'll hear the same 3 soft taps, spaced out exactly the same way, coming from somewhere I can't quite locate, followed by a pause, as if something is still waiting for me to answer.